Shalom Aleichem, welcome. I'm Lisa Newman, the Yiddish Book Center's Director of Publishing and Public Programs. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Yiddish Book Center's virtual theater for this evening's program, Adventures of Max Spitzkopf, the Yiddish Sherlock Holmes with Mikhl Yashinsky. Before we get started, I wanted to mention that your video and your audio will be off throughout the program. We're happy to get questions from you via the question panel located at the bottom right of your screen. We ask that you refrain from sending comments so that we can get to all the questions this evening and keep the questions short, and we'll try to get to all of them. It's always a pleasure to introduce Mikhl Yashinsky. Mikhl was born in Detroit and graduated with a degree in European history and literature from Harvard. Now living in New York City, he works as a teacher, translator, performer, and playwright. With the National Yiddish Folkspiele, Mikhl performed in the Yiddish language Fiddler on the Roof, directed by Joel Grey, and the classic operetta The Sorceress, with both New York Times listed. Sorry, both of those performances were listed by the New York Times as critics' picks. Forgive me, Mikhl. Mikhl writes original full-length Yiddish theater works, among them the drama The Gospel According to Chaim and the musical Feast of the Seven Sinners. He has taught Yiddish at Columbia, the University of Michigan, and Tel Aviv University, and co-authored the award-winning language textbook Ingenuity, published by White Goat Press, Yiddish Book Center. Two books of his recent translations were released in 2025. Adventures of Max Spitzkopf, the Yiddish Sherlock Holmes, published by White Goat Press, and The Mother of Yiddish Theater, Memoirs of Esther Rachel Kaminska, Bloomsbury Press. I'm proud to add that Mikhl is also an alum of many Yiddish Book Center programs and has gone on from there to do amazing things in Yiddish. Welcome, Mikhl.
Oh, thank you, Lisa, for that kind introduction.
Thank you for joining us tonight. You're anything but busy
Yes,
all the time. So it's great to get you. I'm going to turn it over to you and we'll see you afterwards. Thanks.
very good. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you to the Yiddish Book Center for having me and for putting together this book with me. It's been a real joy to work on this book, Adventures of Max Spitzkopf, the Yiddish Sherlock Holmes, over the past number of years, and to finally have it out now with the White Goat Press, the Yiddish Book Center's press. I'm going to tell you about this special book and the special author who wrote these stories that I've translated, and read a bit from the translation and take some questions. So this is our book. The original author of these stories, as you see on the cover, is Jonas Kreppel. This was a Jew from Galicia in the eastern reaches of the Austrian Empire, born 1874 in a town called Drohobych, a shtetl in Galicia. Later, he settled in Vienna and worked as a diplomat there. But he was also a publisher and a printer and a writer. You'll see here, this is one of the original covers and one of the original back covers of the Max Spitzkopf stories, which you can see our cover very much takes inspiration from those covers in the header there, and the illustration is from one of those original pamphlets. These stories, these detective stories, were printed as individual pamphlets, each containing one of the stories. There were 15 of them, each exactly 32 pages. And as you can see, sold for 20 Heller, which was an Austrian currency because these were printed and in the Austrian Empire and largely read there. Some other things to notice. This is the back cover. This is an edition that was eventually bound together of various pamphlets. So here on the left, you see one of the covers of the story Der Schmuggler, the smuggler. And there on the right, you see one of the back covers. The back covers were all pretty much the same. They gave you some promotional copy about these stories. And I think it's worthwhile to read from that copy because it gives you a sense of what these stories were and how they appealed to the Yiddish readers of the day. and that day being 1908 when these stories were published. So this is a translation of the back cover. Max Spitzkopf, King of Detectives, the Viennese Sherlock Holmes. World literature in every language is rich with accounts of the wondrous deeds demonstrated by the famous London private eye, Sherlock Holmes. But Sherlock Holmes is not the only private eye in the world. In almost every great global city, there exist detective bureaus like his. Their entire business is the cracking of mysterious cases, the pursuit of terrible criminals, and the rescue of the victimized and the persecuted. One of the greatest in this line of work is the head of the private investigative bureau Blitz in Vienna, Max Spitzkopf, who is known everywhere as the King of Detectives and the Viennese Sherlock Holmes. This is not a made-up name, and the stories told about him are not made up either. Max Spitzkopf lives and breathes, and the stories about him are the unvarnished truth. Seinen Emis und Trei. Hundreds and thousands of people owe him the deepest gratitude. Hundreds and thousands bless his name every day because he saved them from the severest troubles and quashed their adversaries and oppressors. Hundreds and thousands of criminals are filled with the bitterest hate for him and have sworn vengeance against him. Time and time again he has been in the greatest danger, but every time his razor-sharp mind has saved him. Max Spitzkopf is a Jew, and he has always taken every opportunity to stand up for Jews. Whenever a Jew has faced some injustice and turned to Spitzkopf for help, he has never yet been disappointed, and this makes Spitzkopf particularly interesting for the Jewish reading public. 6 issues have already appeared containing the following stories: Kidnapped for Conversion, The Counterfeiters, The Blood Libel, A Mysterious Murder, The Smugglers, The Forged Will. A new issue comes out every week, and each issue contains a complete and resolved Spitzkopf story. No serialization. Every issue costs 20 Heller, may be procured from all booksellers and also directly from the publisher named below, with the appropriate shipping fee added to the order. And in that, the name of the publisher you see there in German, Jüdischer Roman Verlag, the Jewish novel publisher in Krakow, Grodgasse 62, printed by Josef Fischer in Krakow. Josef Fischer actually happens to have been, that's the publisher, Jonas Kreppel, the author's father-in-law. Jonas Kreppel married Helene Fischer, who was the daughter of this Josef Fischer, and Spitzkopf was in business with his Schwer, with his father-in-law. Printing. That was the only trade that Kreppel actually learned formally, and really his only formal education besides a Jewish education. He rose to become an editor of newspapers and a writer of both pulpy, very popular fiction stories like this and of very serious books, and a diplomat in the Austrian Foreign Service, a sort of a media officer in the foreign diplomatic service of the Austrian Empire. All this without formal university education. You'll see, notice a few things. He's called Der Wiener Sherlock Holmes in the original stories, the Viennese Sherlock Holmes. We've called him in our stories the Yiddish Sherlock Holmes, considering that that's maybe what makes these stories so unique, is that this existed in Yiddish literature. But in the original stories, he's called the Viennese Sherlock Holmes, although in advertisements of the day, I've actually also seen him called Der Jüdische Sherlock Holmes, the Jewish Sherlock Holmes, or the Yiddish Sherlock Holmes. And of course, this Max Spitzkopf, although it says these stories are Emes und Trei, there's no record that he actually existed. But they're presented here as though they are in some way the truth, and in many ways they were. They reflected some of the historical truths of their day because they deal with Jewish persecution, with pogroms, with blood libels, with Jews falsely convicted of espionage, and of course this is right around the time of the Dreyfus affair. So these things they were dealing with, and Spitzkopf was their great hero that they could look to for an example. They could be inspired by these stories. I was working at the book center when we received a donation of five of these stories. They were printed, five of them bound together in one volume, but this is the way it looked. The cover illustration is and was totally indecipherable, so I wasn't sure what was depicted there. I saw geräubt zu der Schmad, kidnapped for conversion, sounded interesting. The back, as you can see, was ripped. But we knew something special was in this mysterious object. And over the years, we've discovered just how special it is. Later, I received more of the stories from Yale. Yale's library has all 15 stories, so they were kind enough to get me the remaining scans. And finally, I also saw this cover image, which you see there, very much worn over time and very hard to see, presenting a mystery of its own. And there we see it clearly. This is the climax of Kidnapped for Conversion, where the kidnapped girl is found in a carriage together with an evil nun, evil priest. There's quite a lot of evil clergymen in the stories, anti-Semitic clergy. This is the writer, Jonas Kreppel, or Joine Kreppel in Yiddish, or if you want to anglicize it, Jonah Kreppel. But anyway, here he is as a young man. Here he is as a somewhat older man, looking very distinguished in both. This is one of the newspapers that he published. I'm going to tell you a little about his career beyond the Spitzkopf stories, which he published actually anonymously. He published the Spitzkopf stories without his name. Maybe this gave them a sort of veneer of truth, or maybe he didn't necessarily want to own up to writing these very pulpy stories. Schund, as it was called in Yiddish literature. Schund is kind of, some might translate it trash. Of course, these stories are very special and very entertaining and really nice, suspenseful stories, but they were considered lowbrow, Schund. So his higher brow career, he edited Yiddish newspapers and German newspapers. This is his Jiddische Korrespondenz. This is a very long tome he wrote called Juden und Judentum von heute, Jews and Jewry, or Judaism of today, published in 1925. This was a long scholarly work about mostly Jewish life in Germany and Austria. He also wrote political tracts, especially during the 1930s as the Nazi threat very much loomed. Here he wrote a book called Das Schicksalsjahr Europas, Deutschland und Österreich in Brennpunkte der Weltpolitik. So this is 1935, the fateful year of Europe, Germany and Austria at the burning point of world politics, where he warns of what the Nazis represented to Jews. He has a line, this is from an earlier political tract in 1918, where he says, Deutsch-Österreich kann auf seine jüdischen Bürger jederzeit rechnen. German Austria can always depend upon its Jewish citizens. He was actually a very proud Austrian, served in Austrian bureaucracy and was a patriot of Austria, but knew how dangerous the Nazis would be to Austria. This is a bibliography of other Schund stories that he published. He published ones outside of the Spitzkopf series, other stories, other titles. I have a few of them that I've picked out here, some of these other titles, just so you can get a sense of what he wrote. Kosaken kommen, Cossacks are coming. Napoleon und der jiddische Rendar, Napoleon and the Jewish innkeeper. Verborgene Silberrubel, hidden silver rubles. Der Edem a Mörder, my son-in-law the murderer. Nachricht von Kinder. Various interesting suspenseful stories. I've translated one of these stories that's set in an Ottoman harem, actually, um, for a scholar who happens to study harems. And he had access to this pamphlet and wanted it translated, but not yet been published in translation. Because of his agitation against the Nazis, he was one of the early victims arrested by the Nazis when they took over after the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria. And here is his card from the concentration camp Buchenwald, his identity card. It identifies him as a Staatsbeamter, a civil servant, and his year of birth in 1874 in Drohobych, his address in Vienna. You'll see here, I think this is a telling detail. Vorstrafen keine. Prior criminal record, none. So unlike all of the criminals that are found in the Spitzkopf stories, of course, Kreppel had not committed any crimes, but here he was arrested and interned. And eventually killed in Buchenwald in the concentration camp, was doing slave labor in a quarry and died overwork, starvation. This is another of his concentration camp identity cards listing his number in the camp as 3229, which others before he was killed and after he was killed also had that number, as you can see. Now, this is a time, a wave of the Nazi persecution when political prisoners were being targeted and killed before masses of Jews, just by virtue of their Jewishness, were rounded up. And it was also a time when possibly remains would have been sent still back to the family at home. So there is a matzeve, a tombstone for Jonas Kreppel in a Jewish cemetery in Vienna. It lists him, Ish tamim b'maasav, a man blameless in his deeds. Ish tashkoilos shahakol boy, and a man, really a Renaissance man of many trades, which he was, shahakol boy, that everything was within him, which is very apt for Kreppel, and lists in German that he was a civil servant, ministerial secretary. Now, this is just to show you how the original covers looked and how they look in our book. This is the story, The Grave Digger. And here it is in ours, The Grave Digger. So each story is accompanied with its original illustration. Some of them sort of a bit primitive looking, but all very interesting. This is The Flesh Peddler, where a girl is stolen from the shtetl, told that this man, this wonderful rich man, wants to marry her, but is sexually trafficked and ends up in Istanbul, where Spitzkopf finds her. This is the climactic moment there. I'll show you all of them. The blood libel. Just go through them fairly quickly so you get to see all the original covers. This is a very gruesome story, The Child Murderess. People have been enjoying the stories, which I'm very glad of. Somebody did tell me that they had to stop in the middle of The Child Murderess because it was getting a little bit too real. But yeah, it definitely goes there, the Spitzkopf stories. There's a lot of humor and a lot of silliness, but a lot of darkness and sometimes gore. Became the cover of our book, Der Spion, the Spy. Since this came out right around the time of the New York City mayoral elections, I think that our New York City mayor, Mamdani, was on people's minds, and someone said, it looks like you have Mamdani on the cover of your book, but that's not Mamdani. This is the villain of The Spy, who's an Italian. And a very violent person, as you can see. This is the currency counterfeiters, Banknotenfälscher. This I found recently. This is I thought, very, very interesting. This is an ad for the Spitzkopf stories that appears also in Galicia, not in Krakow, but in Lviv or Lemberg, in the same year that they were published. And just a wonderful ad. Max Spitzkopf, and here it says, Der Yiddish Sherlock Holmes. So you can see sometimes the Viennese Sherlock Holmes, sometimes the Yiddish or Jewish Sherlock Holmes. Ot das ist die neueste sensationelle Erscheinung in der jüdischen Literatur. This is the newest sensational happening in Yiddish literature. And perhaps the most refined critics wouldn't necessarily agree with that, but a lot of the Jewish reading public did. Also showing you something about the milieu of where these stories were published and that they take place in. Was an Austrian milieu. This was within the Austrian Empire. So you see words throughout the stories and even in this ad that reflect that. Words that aren't necessarily the most Yiddish of words and not even the most standard German of words, but words that are particularly Austrian German. So it lists where you can find the books, the Hauptverschleiß being the administration of the Lemberg Tageblatt of this newspaper. But that word Verschleiß, meaning a merchant, a seller, is particularly Austrian German and it is not used widely across the German-speaking world. So you see indications of that. You can get it at the newspaper offices, these stories, zu bekommen in alle, but also in alle Buchhandlungen, bookstores, Trafiken, tobacco stores, which I think is very interesting and shows you maybe the kind of literature these were. Zeitungsverschleißer, and that word you see there again, newspaper sellers. This is a year later, and now one of the stories is being published. I found this recently in a New York newspaper, but not with Kreppel's name and not anonymous. In fact, a made-up name of Max Bleitstein and called something else. Here it's called Die Soidis von a Galicianer Detektiv, the secrets of a Galician detective. Pretty sure these were pirated and reprinted in New York a year later. Eddie Portnoy recently pointed this out in his review of our book, in the Jewish Review of Books, that Max Bleitstein is an author who never existed. And indeed, if you search his name in the large corpus of scanned Yiddish newspapers, it only turns up these stories printed in this New York Yiddish newspaper, the Spitzkopf stories. This happens to be the blood libel, and it's exactly the blood libel as printed in Kreppel's original pamphlets, but not attributed to him. And here it is elsewhere. This one is given a slightly different title in this edition published in this New York newspaper. It's called Die gefälschte Savoy, the forged will, which in the original Spitzkopf stories, it's Der gefälschte Testament. So one says Testament, one says Savoy. They're the same thing. One's Hebraic, one's Germanic. But very slight changes to maybe evade being found out. But here you have a gefälschte Spitzkopfmeise, sort of a counterfeit Spitzkopf story, but one of them. And I thought interesting just to show you how it looks inside. This is one of the very first page of the first story, Kidnapped for Conversion, which you also see, this is from the edition the Yiddish Book Center has that I first started translating from. Which library this belonged to. This was a library, a reading library and a seller of books on 176 Rivington Street here in New York. And a very nice, the rule that it gives on that cover, on that first page there, it says, Notice, there with the finger, Notice, der Buch muss gehalten werden clean und nicht mehr wie Achtog. This book must be kept clean and kept for no longer than 8 days. You can see people wanted to read this book, wanted to get their hands on it, wanted to have their way with it. I don't know. Thankfully, they did gehalten clean pretty much because I was able to read it. And on one of the inside covers, you have this, which I think is maybe the names of the people who checked it out. It's very hard to make out, but yeah, possibly their names. And once they've returned it, crossed out. This just happens to be that library where that edition came from today. I just thought I'd look it up, and it's just been opened a wine bar there called Baby Sips. So I think it might be a nice idea to read the Spitzkopf stories and go to Baby Sips and have an Austrian wine maybe and read them there. And just like might have been done maybe over a century ago. Um, I want to also read to you this special quotation from Isaac Bashevis Singer, who, before this book came out, really the only way anyone knew about these stories was from Isaac Bashevis Singer because they were printed very cheaply as pulp fiction was, and copies of them would be read, consumed, perhaps thrown out, like comic books, like magazines. So it's very hard to find copies of the original. A few of them are in libraries today around the world, maybe 4 different libraries that I know of. But people knew about them because Bashevis remembered them with great fondness. And this is what he wrote about the stories, which were some of the first stories he read as a youth in Warsaw. And this is a translation of his Yiddish. In my eyes, these detective stories were high art. They simply enchanted me. A sentence from one of the booklets remains with me to this very day. It was a caption to an illustration that depicted Max Spitzkopf and his assistant Fuchs surprising a bandit, revolvers in hand, and the detective is calling out, "Halt, you scoundrel! The game is up!" These naive words resounded in my ears like heavenly music. Haben geklungen in meine Ohren wie himmlische Musik. I invested them with all of my youthful fantasy. So you can see these stories, as trashy as they may have been, inspired a Nobel Prize winning author, inspired him to write. So that, I think, shows what worth there is in some of this popular entertainment that's popular for a reason. Mm. I'll read some from the book for you, from one of the stories. Now, I've done a few of these talks, and I've read different passages. I thought I'd pick one that I haven't read in one of these talks, just in case someone has been to one of those talks and wants to hear me read something else. I often read something from The Flesh Peddler, which I think is one of the um, wildest, most interesting stories. So I do recommend you get the book and read that story. But this one's from The Counterfeiters. Banknotenfälscher, which I'll show you here. Banknotenfälscher, of course, has to do with people who are printing funny money. There, Spitzkopf is finding them out at the end, always with his electric torch and a revolver. Um, but earlier in the story, you have a Jewish man who is falsely convicted of printing funny money. And the first chapter is him in court. And Spitzkopf manages to place some information into hands of one of the prosecutors and get the trial delayed for a bit. And here he comes now to the home of the convicted man, who's a businessman, who's been not convicted yet, but charged with printing counterfeit money or with dealing with counterfeit money in his business. And he comes to his home. The man is, of course, being held in prison, but the woman, his wife, is at home. And Spitzkopf goes there with his identity concealed, which is his MO. So this is Frau in the home of Frau Levinson. At that moment, the housemaid opened the parlor door and announced in German, "Madam, an elegantly dressed gentleman would like to speak with you." "What is his name?" Frau Levinson asked. He did not wish to say, but he says that his visit concerns a most important matter, and that it's within your interests to receive him. Frau Levinson thought it over a moment, then said to the girl, "What have I to lose? Let him in." In a matter of seconds, a man who was indeed most elegantly dressed stood before her. He bowed in a gallant manner and greeted her with a cordial air. "Whom might I have the honor of addressing, my good sir?" Frau Levinson asked. "I could provide you with some arbitrary name, but I won't. Who I am, madam, is quite beside the point. I wish to take action on behalf of your innocent, wrongly accused husband, and to that purpose I would like you to answer a few of my questions." "My good sir, I will not permit you to speak in such tones to me," Frau Levinson interrupted. "If I do not know who you are, I can hardly enter into such a discourse with you. Madam, later you shall come to regard me in quite a different light. Your distrust is quite understandable, but you have nothing to fear. I must, for the time being, conceal my name from you. But is it possible we are being overheard?" With that, the man went to the door and bolted it shut. "Sir, how dare you?" Frau Levinson called out, her voice raised to an excited pitch. "Remove yourself from the premises at once, or I shall cry for help." "Shh, shh. Don't be afraid. The fate of your husband is in my hands. Whether you wish to or not, you must listen to me and answer my questions. First, I must ask you something of particular delicacy, Frau Levinson. Do you have, or does your husband have, any enemies?" "Well, everyone has enemies, but we have never done anyone ill. As far as I know, my husband is well loved and respected by all who know him. Likewise, in his business, he is always honest and strictly on the level, such that no one could rightly accuse him of anything untoward. And as for me, I could hardly believe that I have some personal enemy. It could be that wicked people, those who would begrudge us our success, may be envious." He's a rich Jewish businessman, this Levinson. "Maybe a former friend was jealous of me at one time or another for having found such happiness. But there is a considerable distance between envy and enmity." "I don't quite mean that," the gentleman said. "You or your husband must have a most formidable enemy for you to have landed in such hot water. But now for an even more delicate question. Has your husband ever had a relationship with another woman, whether now or before your nuptials?" This question hurt Frau Levinson to the quick, but she restrained herself and answered curtly, "As for now, surely not. This I could swear to. And as for before our wedding, it would not have been the case either." She concluded, the agitation rising again in her voice. "What do you want from me anyhow with such questions? Why should such things be of concern to you?" The gentleman did not let her agitation hold him back, however, and he carried on with his questioning. "And you, Frau Levinson, do you have now, or did you have before your wedding, a relationship with some other man?" This proved too much for the unfortunate woman. She shook with rage and responded in a raised, trembling voice, "Sir, you have become impertinent. How dare you pose such questions? Do you believe that because I am weak and broken, you are permitted to deal with me however you wish? Leave my home at once, or I shall positively shriek for help. Not another word out of you." And with these words, she leapt to the door and clutched at the handle. But the gentleman just kept on sitting quietly in his chair, answering with an icy air, "The agitation you display shows me that I am on the right track. Whether you want to answer me or not is all the same to me now. Naturally, it would be more advantageous if you were to give me the particulars that I seek. We would be able to hit our target more quickly. The query that I have just put to you contains in it the key to this entire case. If you wish for your husband to be set free, you must answer this question clearly and with the utmost precision." And it goes on, him interrogating, trying to be as calm and as kind as he can, but also quite direct in asking Frau Levinson about her past relationships or those of her husband that might have led to his being arrested. But you'll have to get the book to see how that conversation develops and what happens in the end. I'll just read one more paragraph because there's a bit of, sometimes I keep a bit of Yiddish where there's a piquant bit of Yiddish in the original, and I want the reader to have access to that. But eventually, the defense attorney shows up after Spitzkopf leaves and talks about the trial being delayed. And he says, I figured that the delay in any case couldn't hurt. Zeit gewonnen, alles gewonnen, as we say. Gain time and you gain everything. And so, with that in mind, I asked for the pause in the proceedings. Any further details than that, I simply do not know. The lawyer's narrative only added to Frau Levenson's astonishment. Something much to be wondered at is taking place. Maybe yet another wonder awaits us. She did not tell him of her parley with the unknown gentleman. And after the lawyer left, she remained sitting where she was, lost in her melancholy and uncertain thoughts. There a nice portrait in that chapter of a desperate wife, whose husband is being wrongly convicted. The stories are full of really nicely drawn characters, full of emotion, full of injustice against Jews. And that's what makes what made these stories very special and very popular, is not the suspense, but that it spoke to the Yiddish reading public. And I hope it will speak to readers today, wherever they come from and whatever faith they subscribe to, because ultimately these are stories of standing up against hatred and against injustice and being brave in the face of it. So that's that. And I'll now take questions from Lisa and from our audience.
Thank you, thank you. Always a great presentation, thank you. And lots of questions, so I'm going to try to rip through these really quickly. And many people have asked, and I'll start with this comment, is this available in English? Yes, this is an English language translation from the original Yiddish, translated by Mikhl himself. And is the book available? Yes, the book is available, and there'll be information at the end of this program on how you can purchase it from shop.yiddishbookcenter.org and wherever you buy your books, but we hope you buy your books at shop.yiddishbookcenter.org. And end of commercial announcement, if you're a member, you get 10% discount. All right. Were the stories available in German or another language for non-Jews to read?
Not that I know of. I believe this is the first ever translation of these stories. I believe they've only ever appeared in Yiddish before.
A related question. How hard was it to do the translation of his work?
All translation is hard, especially literary translation, where you're trying to capture the flavor of the original and also having to think creatively about how to transmit it for readers today. Uh, it was hard, but it was also very fun, because these stories are very fun stories. And as I was translating, I was also just getting to read great stories and go on these adventures. So sitting down to do this work was very pleasurable. Um, yeah, I'd say definitely. And I would try to sit in, a lot of the stories take place in bars, smoky bars or coffee shops, some of those Viennese atmospheres. So I would like to sit in cafes or bars and translate and sort of imagine I was there in Vienna with Spitzkopf.
How popular were the Spitzkopf stories at the time of their publishing? Do you know this?
I'm sure they were very, very popular. That's the account that we have from people of the day who have written about them, that these were very popular stories. There's one interesting account I've read from the Grand Rebbe of the Satmar Chassidim, who in his Yiddish memoirs writes about, as a young person, seeing people read the stories of Jonas Kreppel, of Joine Kreppel, and wondering these stories, these adventure stories, these stories of suspense, Jews everywhere are reading these stories as if they're holy writ, and what could be in these stories. And he says that that name, Kreppel, remained with him for years after in the Kreppel of his own mind. Kreppel also means dumpling. So he says this name remained in my own dumpling of a mind, my Kreppel, because it was just seemed to be this magic thing that people were in love with these stories that were not at all kosher stories. So this remained with him. That gives us a sense of how popular these were.
And you answered one of the questions about Kreppel's name, or is Spitzkopf's name mean anything?
Yeah, Spitzkopf. So Kreppel is dumpling, so that's a cute name, but is his real last name. Spitzkopf literally is pointy head, either the top of your head or a head that's forms a point. So it's a reference to his intelligence, that it's almost like he has a pointy head. That's how sharp his intelligence is. So it's a reference to that. Yeah.
Uh, we've got a bit of a comment, but I'm going to sort of turn it into a question, which is interesting to hear because readers would not be used to such racy matters in traditional Jewish cultural settings. Do you want to comment on that a little bit? Do you think that that's the case with these?
I think so. I think these are definitely racy stories. And it's kind of a wonder to think. I'm going to show some of the covers again, just because it's a wonder to think that Jews going about, looking at Yiddish printed material in a bookstore or a newsstand would see covers, shocking covers like this. Here we have an almost naked young woman and the proprietress of this brothel who is in the process of whipping her into submission. And that's there. That's the cover. So I think it is surprising for people that such things existed in Yiddish literature, but it is telling, revealing of the fact that Yiddish literature was it's not necessarily what we would expect it to be. This was not necessarily from literature that conformed to certain religious standards. Jews were reading the most modern sorts of poetry, erotic things, crime stories, suspense. And you did have, of course, traditional people, rabbis, railing against this kind of material and people who consumed it and telling the yeshiva bochrim not to go and read this sort of stuff. Of course, this still happens today. But and that's one thing I think Aaron Lansky, our founder, would often say is that the Hasidic community doesn't necessarily read this kind of secular literature in Yiddish, even though their language is Yiddish. But if you look at where these books have been downloaded from our digital library, there have been a lot of downloads from Hasidic centers in Brooklyn. So people are discovering this literature and reading it no matter what.
Um, are there any Jewish villains in his stories?
Mostly the villains are Gentiles. I'm trying to think if there are. No, not really. Pretty much the heroes and the victims are Jews, and the antagonists are Gentiles. That's pretty much the setup of these stories.
Uh, Michal, I should know the answer to this as well, but do we know who the illustrator was who did the engravings? I don't think we do.
No, there's no name given, and in none of the material I've found has that been discovered. Um, I do think that there's probably two illustrators, just because some of them are of this kind of primitive quality, not necessarily the most beautifully drawn, and others are really nicely drawn. Like the one we chose, or that you chose for the cover, I think, is a good piece of art, I think. It's striking and the characters are well drawn. Not all of them are quite like that. Some of them are a touch amateurish, but I think that also gives them a sort of pulpy appeal. But yeah, I don't think we know.
No, and I agree. Some of them are rendered with a lot of precision, and some
Hmm.
of them feel a little bit more like they're brushstroked,
Yeah.
but they're great all the same.
Hmm.
Much to it. Um, okay, hang on. These are um, you'd mentioned the stories were exactly 32 pages each. Why is that? And maybe could you also speak a little bit about serialized literature and sort of how did most of Shund originally appear as serialized and then become bound into these books,
Hmm.
to the pamphlets?
A lot of the Shund was indeed serialized in newspapers, in dailies, or so it would appear one chapter, and then it would say at the end, Fortsetzung kommt, continuation coming. And then you would have to buy the next edition of the newspaper the next week to read the continuation of the story. These stories were not serialized originally. They were each published in their own pamphlet, which in the advertisements around it and on the back cover, that's one of the great virtues of these pamphlets, apparently, is that they each contain a complete Spitzkopf story. So if you buy one, you don't have to buy next week's to see what happens. Um, why they're all 32 pages, that has to do with how books were printed and published. You probably know more about that than me, Lisa, but all of his stories I've found that were published in these pamphlets, not just the 15 Spitzkopf stories, but actually 100 other pulp stories that he published, each of them exactly 32 pages.
And the reason for that is because you have to print in multiples of 8 pages. So there, I put on my publishing hat, now
Yes.
another program hat, and ask you more questions. This is an interesting one. Has anyone ever, from your knowledge, made a staged theatrical version of any of these stories? Has Mikhl ever considered doing this? Why, yes.
Yes, we just had the great pleasure of putting on a theatrical adaptation of one of the stories, not completely made into a whole full-blown play. That would be a great thing to do one day, and I'd love to. But this was a sort of theatrical reading of me reading one of the stories, The Gravedigger, in my translation, and Abigail Reisman and two other musicians playing music along with it. Some of that music chosen by Abigail, some of it actually newly composed by Abigail. And it was wonderful. We did this at the Vilna Shul in Boston. This was their sort of, they brought us there to do this and to create this piece. So I'm grateful to them. It was a wonderful night where we did a kind of immersive clue finding theatrical kind of reading of one of the stories, taking you on one of these adventures with Spitzkopf together with music. And actually, I wrote a song together with Abigail. She wrote the music and I wrote the words that is a sort of Spitzkopf theme tune that we sang at the end of that. So yeah, I don't, would it be fun to sing that, a bit of that?
I was actually going to ask you
Okay.
that at the end. I think
Okay, we'll do it
everybody
at
would
the
love
end.
to hear this. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you a couple of other questions. We have so many questions. So bear with me while I try to scroll through all of this. Yeah. Do the original pamphlets exist?
Yeah, the original pamphlets exist. Five of them are at the Yiddish Book Center. I think behind glass, possibly now in our in the wonderful museum
Exhibition. Yeah.
exhibition, Yiddish a Global Culture. So there's a whole panel on the Spitzkopf and Kreppel with those pamphlets. If you go to the Yale University Library, you can probably touch the actual pamphlets. Yeah, they're there in a few libraries.
It's remarkable, though, when you think about it, that they survived. These were
Mhm.
very ephemeral. The paper is so fragile, which is why we have it behind glass for the
Yeah.
copy that we have. It's the kind of thing when you discovered it, and we all look at it when these come out of boxes and you think, incredible, incredible
Yeah.
that they actually survived. Also, I think with the Shunden, you might agree, Mikkel, what we've seen with other books that we have, the Melania and some of the Clara series and all of that. These were read and read and read and stuck in pockets, so they're just sort of held together by a wing and a prayer, as it were.
Yeah. Yeah, there's another panel right in the exhibition just about Schund, other examples of Schund. And I love one title that's there. It's Wo is mein Bord? Where is my beard? which I'm dying to know what that story actually involves.
Do you think any of the stories reveal details about the personal life of the character of Spitzkopf and how he became a crime fighter?
You don't get too much backstory. No, you don't get a whole origin story of how he became who he became. You do see bits of him in between cases. Often a story will open with him having just completed a case, and now he's taking some time to rest. But it's not long before someone comes to him with new tsores. But apparently, in between cases, when he's not solving a case, which seems to be his greatest passion, and the way he spends most of his time, he'll sit on he'll lie on his divan chair, on his sofa, and he'll smoke and try to get some sleep. But he's never allowed to do that very long because there's always someone wanting his help. Um, what you do get, I think, in terms of the most personal thing you learn about him is his very close relationship with his assistant Fuchs, Hermann Fuchs, who's the Watson to Spitzkopf's Holmes. And they have a close relationship. And there are some touching scenes of one of them has been knocked over the head, as invariably happens in the stories, and the other comes to the other's rescue. And there's scenes of them blotting each other's wounds and undoing each other's ropes and chains and having moments of connection before they go on to look for the baddies. So that's a special kind of relationship. But you don't hear about any family, any female love interests, anything like that.
Which sort of relates to this question. Do you know how much influence did Arthur Conan Doyle have on the author?
Yeah, definitely. He's named right there on the back cover, the Sherlock Holmes stories, and they were, of course, extremely popular in their day. So this is a way to kind of hitch Spitzkopf's star to Holmes's in getting people interested in these stories. There are similarities. That relationship between the two of them is in some ways similar, although Fuchs is actually his hired assistant. He has a number of young men working as his assistants, and Fuchs is one of them. He's the Hauptassistent. Whereas Watson is a doctor who it happens to be his roommate and comes along with him on his cases. But I guess in one way that they're different, quite different, is well, of course, they deal with largely anti-Jewish crimes, and also the pacing, I think, is different. It's less of that very careful deduction and more sort of adventuresome. We move from one plot point to the next in pursuing the criminals. And to me, it gives me a sense of the Jews, they don't necessarily have all the time that the imperiled people have in the home stories, who might often be rich, English, noble people. The shtetl Jews just don't have the time, and they need to find their captives and find the baddies and have it wrapped up, God willing, as soon as possible. So that's the sense we get from these stories. Oh,
I was muted. Sorry, everybody. Let's do a quick bit of the song, if you could, and then I'm going to come back on and give some more details. But I think this would be a fun way to cap it off.
very good. So this is our theme tune that we've written, Abigail Reisman and I, about Spitzkopf. I don't have her playing her wonderful fiddle with me, so I'll just manage as best I can.
And it's pretty wonderful, everybody.
King of all sleuths, Max Spitzkopf, greatest detective in Wien. By hook or by crook, in the gnarliest nook, Spitzkopf will find where you've been. No evading, no awaiting, top private eye, Max Spitzkopf, chief of the best bureau blitz. The baddies all clench, they fear that mensch who snoops without stopping to schwitz. Together with Fuchs, his sweet second banan, an electric torch in his hand. A light will be shown on injustice, its victims and vilest bands, and the name of the famed Max Spitzkopf, greatest detective in Wien, etc.
Fantastic. Mikhl, thank you a million for this and everything else you do related to Yiddish. You bring so much to all of us. So thank you. Again, for everybody out there, the book is Adventures of Max Spitzkopf, the Yiddish Sherlock Holmes, available at shop.yiddishbookcenter.org and elsewhere. I want to thank our producer this evening, Aaron Koppler. Tonight's program is part of an ongoing series of virtual and live public programs. To learn about our upcoming events, visit yiddishbookcenter.org/events, where you will find a full calendar of virtual and in-person events, some at the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst and in cities around the country, and happy to announce overseas. You can join us live in London Sunday, March 8th as part of Jewish Book Week, when David Mazauer will be in conversation about Yiddish, a global culture, bold lives, boundless curiosity. And Mikhl will be part of Jewish Book Week virtually with his program as well. You'll find full details for all of these programs, including the soon-to-be-announced lineup for Yidstock 2026, which takes place at the Yiddish Book Center, as always, our annual festival Yidstock, July 19th through 13th. I'd like to take a minute to thank all of you in the audience, our members, whose support makes all of our ongoing work possible. To learn more about membership, to join, to make a sustaining gift, or to give a gift membership or a tribute gift, yiddishbookcenter.org/donate. Thanks for joining us this evening. Hope to see you back in the virtual theater or at one of the many programs taking place across the country and in London. Until then, stay well, stay healthy, and stay in touch. Good night.